The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all to all of our witnesses here today sharing their expertise and their story. And Mr. Cullen, thank you for sharing your son's story with us here in the committee. And I think it's tremendously important that we communicate to you that what happened to your son will not happen in vain, and that we are going to fight to make sure that there's real change that happens to ensure that victims across the country are protected from this happening ever again. I represent the South Bronx, and the South Bronx, historically, if it were its own state, would have the second highest per capita rate of overdoses in the entire country, second only to West Virginia. And so this is a well-known issue in our community. I, like the ranking member, keep Narcan in my car. We have communities that have been ravaged by fentanyl. And one thing that's also in New York's 14th congressional district is Rikers Jail. We've seen the impacts of Schedule I on certain drugs and substances. And these scheduling differences matter. Schedule II, Schedule I, Schedule III, et cetera. When we look at the impacts of these things, what I think is very important when we look at Schedule I is the presence of mandatory minimums. And what happens in mandatory minimums is that many of the victims of fentanyl distribution, drug distribution, themselves become incarcerated, while many of the upstream distributors go off scot-free. If we want to address this issue, we need to look at financial crimes. And in fact, many of the industries responsible for supercharging the distribution of fentanyl are getting off without enforcement. And one such industry is crypto. And I think it's very important that if we want to make sure that we take an important approach on this, we need to go after the folks who are responsible for the upstream distribution of this. But I want to put that aside. Ms. LaBelle, in your testimony, you named some very key different factors in this crisis and how we can address it. First, you named transnational efforts, which I think are tremendously important, and to that extent, addressing the financial choke points that actually reward fentanyl trafficking. But then secondly, you talked about prevention and treatment. And one thing that I thought was very significant in your testimony is you naming the healthcare agencies that are responsible for helping reduce fentanyl and fentanyl use. And one of the things that you named was not just the CDC, the NIH, we also named Medicaid. Would it be fair to say that Medicaid is actually one of the most important and strongest protections we have in the opioid crisis in the United States?
Yes. It treats a lot of people with addiction who would not otherwise be able to receive care.
And cutting off Medicaid and cutting off access to Medicaid could potentially increase the fentanyl crisis in the United States and certainly result in deaths from the fentanyl crisis.
I think it's safe to say that if Medicaid were significantly reduced, more people would die of overdoses.
So we're talking about the prospect of cutting Medicaid as exploding the fentanyl crisis in the United States. And I imagine you see in many communities where there are fentanyl, when there's widespread fentanyl use, there's also large interplays with the Medicaid system, correct?
Yes.
Can you explain that a little bit further, what you see?
So, I mean, people are, especially in Medicaid expansion states, I mean, one area that I keep bringing up, but it's so important, and we've done a lot of work on this at Georgetown, is people upon leaving incarceration are at 10 times greater risk of overdose. Mm-hmm. And so cutting off Medicaid for that population will leave them not only probably more mortality, but also increase their risk. They're just going to end up back in prison.
So one of the things you were saying, very importantly, someone leaving incarceration is at 10 times higher risk of overdose demand. And so incarcerating people too broadly can also create a demand on fentanyl because these are people who are struggling with a lot of these issues. And I think one of the things that is important for us to see here is in those threats to Medicaid, just last month in our continuing resolution, we had bipartisan efforts to address fentanyl, including expansion of Medicaid to address the fentanyl crisis, treatment that the Republican majority stripped on orders of Elon Musk. People are dying because of this. And we have to make sure that we are protecting our Medicaid system, not cutting it, because cuts to Medicaid are going to expand are going to expand our fentanyl crisis. And with that, I yield back.